Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Sometimes the greatest love story begins with the worst possible first impression. Rain hammered the windshield as Maren Holloway tightened both hands around the steering wheel of her 12-year-old Subaru, her heartbeat louder than the weather outside. The dashboard clock flashed 3:42 p.m. The wedding ceremony had started 12 minutes ago. She had rehearsed this day for months with her best friend, promised she would never be late, promised she would stand beside her through every smile, every tear, every memory they would one day tell their children. Yet here she was, creeping through the winding driveway of Blackwood Ridge Resort with damp curls escaping her carefully pinned hairstyle, mascara threatening to smudge, and the lavender bridesmaid dress she had spent 3 evenings altering by hand now stained with muddy rainwater near the hem. Most people would have blamed the traffic. Others would have blamed the storm. Maren blamed neither. 25 minutes earlier, she had pulled onto the shoulder of a quiet county road because an elderly woman had slipped while trying to gather groceries scattered across the pavement. Helping had cost her precious minutes, but driving away had never been an option. That was simply who she was, even when kindness demanded a price she could hardly afford. She finally parked beside a row of luxury vehicles that looked more expensive than every possession she owned combined. For one uneasy second, she caught her reflection in the rain-speckled window. The dress still looked elegant despite the stains. The tiny silver earrings belonged to her late mother. Her bouquet was wrapped with a faded lavender ribbon, secured by an old floral brooch whose delicate petals had been repaired so many times the tiny cracks had become part of its beauty. Her mother used to smile whenever she wore it and whisper the same sentence every spring. Someone who arrives late can still arrive exactly when they're needed. Maren gently touched the brooch before taking a long breath. "Please let that be true today," she whispered. She grabbed the bouquet, pushed open the car door, and sprinted through the rain. The sprawling resort felt less like a hotel and more like a palace built for people who had never needed to read a price tag. Marble walkways stretched in every direction. Towering windows reflected gray clouds above. Every hallway seemed identical. Her phone battery had died nearly an hour earlier, leaving her without directions or messages from the bridal party. She hurried through one corridor after another, passing polished artwork, crystal chandeliers, and elegantly dressed guests who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged. She certainly did not. "Excuse me, Chapel?" she asked a passing server, but he was already balancing trays toward another ballroom. Panic tightened around her chest. Music echoed somewhere in the distance. She guessed it came from the ceremony and rushed toward the nearest set of double doors without stopping to read the polished brass sign mounted beside them. She pushed them open so quickly that the heavy doors bounced softly against the walls. "I'm so sorry. I know I'm late," she blurted before looking up. The room fell strangely quiet. It wasn't the bridal suite. It wasn't even close. Sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. Tailored suits hung neatly along one wall. A single man stood near a mirror adjusting the cuff of his charcoal jacket. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall, composed, impossibly calm despite the chaos racing through Maren's mind. His blue eyes lifted from the mirror and settled on her with quiet surprise. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Maren barely noticed how expensive the suit looked or how naturally confidence seemed to follow him. She only noticed the small black communication earpiece resting on the table beside him and assumed exactly what any frantic bridesmaid would assume. Relief rushed across her face. "Oh, thank goodness," she breathed. "You work here." Before the stranger could answer, she hurried toward him, turned around, carefully lifted her hair away from the back of her neck, and said with complete sincerity, "Could you please help me zip up my dress? Whoever designed bridesmaid dresses clearly hated women, and I'm already 40 minutes late." The man stared at her for exactly 2 seconds before a slow, almost amused smile reached the corner of his mouth. He had probably negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, but nothing in his carefully scheduled afternoon had prepared him for a rain-soaked bridesmaid ordering him to fix her dress. Callum Whitmore glanced at the half-open doorway, then back at the woman standing with her back toward him, clutching a bouquet that had clearly survived a battle with the weather. Without saying a word, He carefully pulled the zipper into place, making certain not to snag the delicate fabric. "There," he said quietly. Marin let out a relieved sigh. "Thank you. You officially saved a friendship." She spun around with a grateful smile that lasted only a second before panic returned to her face. "Can you point me toward the chapel? I have managed to get lost in what feels like the fanciest maze in America." Callum raised an eyebrow. "You took a wrong turn. I noticed that part." She laughed nervously while brushing a loose curl behind her ear. "I swear these hallways multiply every time I look away." He picked up a folded ceremony program from the nearby table and pointed toward another corridor. "Go through the garden gallery, take the staircase on the left, then the second set of doors." Marin stared at him for a moment before shaking her head. "I am never going to remember all that." A soft chuckle escaped him. "Then I will walk you there." "Really? It is on my way." Technically it was. Every hallway inside Blackwood Ridge Resort belonged to the company he had built from the ground up. They stepped into the corridor together. Marin hurried beside him, trying unsuccessfully to smooth the wrinkles from her dress. "I cannot believe this is happening," she muttered. "My best friend trusted me with one job. Show up on time wearing a lavender dress. I barely accomplished half of that." Callum glanced toward the muddy hem of her skirt. "Looks like you had an interesting afternoon." That is one way to describe it. She smiled despite herself. An older woman dropped groceries in the rain. She insisted she was fine, but there was no way I was leaving her alone. By the time I helped her get home, I was already late. She shrugged as though the explanation hardly mattered. "Life happens." Callum studied her expression. There was no hint that she expected praise. She simply stated the facts and kept walking. In his world, almost everyone explained their good deeds as though presenting evidence in court. Marin acted as if kindness required no audience at all. They rounded another corner where staff members hurried past carrying floral arrangements and polished silver trays. Several employees smiled politely at Callum before quickly looking away. Marin assumed they recognized him because he worked at the resort. "You must be pretty important around here," she said. "Everyone seems to know you." "I have been here a long time," he answered truthfully. "That explains it." She nodded. "You have the calm voice of someone who has rescued at least 100 wedding disasters." "Perhaps a few." "Then tell me honestly, am I about to become the worst bridesmaid in history?" "No." His answer came without hesitation. People rarely remember who arrived late. They remember who showed up when it mattered. Marin slowed her pace just enough to look at him. The words reminded her so much of her mother that she almost stopped walking altogether. That is surprisingly comforting. Before he could respond, the sound of string music floated through the hallway. The ceremony had not reached the vows yet. Relief washed across her face. "I still have a chance." She reached the chapel entrance and turned toward him with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, mister." She paused, realizing she had never asked his name. Callum hesitated for the briefest moment. "Callum." "Well, Callum, whoever signs your paycheck should give you a raise." He smiled. "I will keep that in mind." Marin laughed, completely unaware of the irony, then hurried through the chapel doors just as the wedding procession continued. Hidden among the guests, Callum quietly entered through a side aisle moments later and took his reserved seat in the front row. Across the room, one of the groomsmen leaned over with a grin. "About time you got here, Callum. We were starting to think the billionaire skipped the wedding." At that exact moment, Marin slipped into the line of bridesmaids without looking toward the front, still convinced the thoughtful man who had rescued her from disaster was nothing more than an experienced resort manager. The ceremony unfolded beneath towering white oak beams wrapped with soft greenery, while warm afternoon light spilled through the chapel windows and settled across rows of smiling faces. Marin finally caught her breath as she slipped into place beside the other bridesmaids. Her best friend, Sophie, gave her the smallest reassuring smile before turning back toward the minister. No questions, no disappointment, just relief. Marin quietly mouthed the words, "I am sorry," and Sophie answered with an almost invisible nod that seemed to say, "You made it." The knot inside Marin's chest loosened for the first time all afternoon. She folded her hands around the bouquet and tried to focus on the vows instead of the embarrassing entrance she had barely survived. Every few seconds, however, her eyes drifted toward the front row. The calm resort employee who had rescued her from complete disaster now sat among the honored guests. listening with the same quiet expression he seemed to wear naturally. She smiled to herself. Maybe every luxury resort needed someone exactly like him. Someone who remained steady while everyone else panicked. Meanwhile, Callum found himself paying far less attention to the ceremony than he had intended. His oldest college friend was getting married, yet somehow his thoughts kept returning to the woman standing only 30 feet away with damp curls escaping her elegant hairstyle and muddy shoes hidden beneath layers of lavender fabric. She had not apologized for helping a stranger. She had not exaggerated her kindness. She had simply accepted being late because, to her, doing the right thing had mattered more than arriving on schedule. That realization lingered in his mind longer than the wedding vows themselves. After the ceremony ended, guests drifted toward the gardens overlooking the lake for photographs, while a string quartet played beneath the covered terrace. The storm had passed, leaving tiny drops of rain sparkling on every flower. Marin immediately set aside her own comfort and began helping wherever she was needed. One bridesmaid struggled with a broken heel, so Marin quietly switched shoes with her because they happened to wear the same size. Another guest accidentally brushed against one of the floral displays, knocking several white roses loose. Before anyone else even noticed, Marin crouched beside the arrangement, gently repositioning every stem until it looked untouched. She moved through the celebration almost invisibly, solving little problems before they became real ones. Callum watched all of it from across the lawn. "You are staring," his friend Ethan said with an amused grin while adjusting his tie. "Am I? You have looked in exactly one direction for the last 5 minutes." Callum followed Ethan's gaze toward Marin and answered with unusual honesty. "She notices everyone except herself." Ethan laughed softly. "Then go introduce yourself after the photos." "I already have." "Really? She believes I manage the resort." Ethan nearly choked on his champagne. "And you did not correct her?" Callum looked toward Marin again as she carefully straightened a flower girl's abandoned basket before handing it back to one of the wedding coordinators. There never seemed to be the right moment. Before Ethan could answer, the photographer called everyone closer to the lakeside dock for the final wedding portraits. A gentle breeze drifted across the water, lifting Sophie's long veil into the air. The delicate fabric floated higher than anyone expected before gliding toward the edge of the dock. Several guests gasped as the veil continued moving with the wind. Without hesitation, Marin hurried after it. She caught one corner, but the damp wooden boards beneath her shoes were still slick from the earlier rain. Her balance shifted. The bouquet slipped from her hands. Just before she could stumble forward, another hand wrapped firmly around her wrist. She looked up into familiar blue eyes. "Easy," Callum said quietly. "I have got you." For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. The sounds of laughter, cameras, and conversation seemed to fade behind the steady rhythm of water touching the dock below. Marin recovered her footing and let out an embarrassed laugh. "Twice in one day. I really owe you." "You owe me nothing." As she bent to retrieve the bouquet, something small loosened from the lavender ribbon and landed silently between the wooden planks. Callum noticed it before she did. It was the old silver floral brooch that had held the ribbon together, its worn petals catching a beam of afternoon sunlight. He carefully picked it up, turning it over in his palm. The metal was scratched with age, but someone had repaired it so lovingly that every imperfection somehow made it more beautiful. "This belongs to you," he said. Marin accepted it with surprising tenderness, gently brushing away a tiny drop of water before fastening it back onto the ribbon. "It belonged to my mother," she said softly. "She always believed beautiful things were worth fixing instead of replacing." Those words settled quietly inside Callum's heart, and without fully understanding why, he realized he had just been handed something far more valuable than an old piece of silver. The wedding portraits finally came to an end just as the first hints of golden evening light spread across Blackwood Ridge Resort, transforming the rain-soaked gardens into something that looked almost unreal. Guests slowly made their way toward the grand ballroom where the reception would begin in less than an hour, while the wedding staff rushed in every direction making final adjustments. Marin slipped away from the crowd, grateful for a few quiet minutes before the celebration continued. She found her aging Subaru exactly where she had left it, tossed her emergency sewing kit and spare shoes into the passenger seat, then slid behind the steering wheel. She turned the key once. Nothing. She tried again. The engine answered with a tired clicking sound before falling silent. Marin rested her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes. Please, not today. She waited a few seconds before trying a third time. The same hollow click echoed through the empty parking area. She let out a slow breath, climbed back outside, and lifted the hood even though she understood almost nothing about engines. She stared at the maze of metal and hoses as if determination alone might fix it. Car trouble. The familiar voice made her turn around. Callum stood a few feet away with his suit jacket folded neatly over one arm, looking more relaxed than anyone attending an elegant wedding had a right to look. Marin laughed softly. Apparently my car decided it deserves the evening off. He stepped beside her, glanced inside the engine compartment, then smiled apologetically. I wish I could tell you exactly what is wrong, but I would probably only make it worse. Well, that makes two of us. She leaned against the fender and looked toward the ballroom entrance where staff members hurried inside, carrying fresh flower arrangements. I still have to deliver centerpieces that I finished this morning. They are waiting in a refrigerated storage room across the property, and if they do not make it into the ballroom soon, my best friend's reception is going to look very different from what she dreamed about. Callum looked toward the distant service building. How far? About half a mile. I can drive you. Marin shook her head instinctively. I cannot ask you to do that. You are working. My schedule is flexible. She smiled. That sounds like something every good manager says. Callum almost corrected her, then decided against it. Come on, he said. It is only a short trip. Instead of leading her toward one of the sleek luxury vehicles parked near the private entrance, he walked to a modest dark gray sedan parked beneath a maple tree. It was clean, comfortable, and completely ordinary. Marin climbed into the passenger seat without a second thought. As they drove slowly through the winding roads of the resort, silence settled comfortably between them before she finally spoke. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever get tired of weddings? He smiled while keeping his eyes on the road. Why would I? Because people spend months planning every tiny detail, then panic when one little thing goes wrong. She laughed quietly. Today alone I have been late, nearly fell into a lake, almost lost my mother's brooch, and now my car refuses to start. Yet the bride smiled. Marin nodded. That is all that matters. She looked out the window as the gardens passed by. Perfect days are overrated anyway. People remember how they felt, not whether every flower faced exactly the right direction. Callum listened carefully. In boardrooms, he spent every day with executives who measured success through numbers, rankings, and quarterly reports. Sitting beside Marin, success somehow sounded much simpler. They reached the storage building, and together they loaded carefully arranged floral centerpieces into the back seat. Every arrangement was unique, woven with white roses, eucalyptus, and small sprigs of lavender tied together by hand. These are beautiful, Callum said honestly. Marin smiled with quiet pride. My mother taught me that flowers should never look manufactured. She said they should remind people that real beauty is slightly imperfect. Callum gently lifted one arrangement, noticing the same weathered silver brooch securing the ribbon around the largest centerpiece. You use her brooch often. Only for weddings. Her voice softened. It makes me feel like she is still helping me. As they drove back toward the ballroom, Marin stared through the windshield for a thoughtful moment before speaking again. Can I tell you a secret? You can. My little flower shop might not survive another month. She laughed, although there was sadness behind it. The building owner raised the rent again. I keep hoping business will improve, but fresh flowers do not always win against grocery store bouquets. She quickly shrugged as though dismissing her own worries. I will figure something out. I always do. Callum tightened his grip on the steering wheel without saying a word. For the first time in years, a business problem no longer looked like a number on a financial report. It had a face, a voice, and kind eyes that refused to ask anyone for rescue, even when life clearly was not being gentle with her. By the time they carried the last floral centerpiece into the ballroom, the room had transformed into a sea of candlelight, polished glass, and quiet excitement. Every table reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, while musicians tuned their instruments near the dance floor. Marin smiled with relief as she stepped back to admire the arrangements. Despite the frantic afternoon, everything looked exactly the way Sophie had imagined. She barely had time to exhale before one of the wedding coordinators rushed across the room with panic written across her face. "Where is the main sweetheart table arrangement?" she asked breathlessly. Several staff members exchanged confused looks. Another coordinator hurried toward the loading entrance and returned moments later with even worse news. The delivery company accidentally left the centerpiece behind. They are over an hour away. A heavy silence spread through the ballroom. The sweetheart table sat directly beneath a large floral arch, and without its centerpiece the entire design would look incomplete in every photograph. The head coordinator immediately began searching for someone to blame. Her eyes landed on Marin. "This happened because everything was delayed after you arrived late." Marin opened her mouth, then quietly closed it again. She knew arguing would waste valuable time. Sophie deserved solutions, not excuses. "How much time do we have?" she asked calmly. "Less than 45 minutes before the guests come inside." The coordinator folded her arms. "Unless you can create another arrangement out of thin air." Marin looked around the ballroom. She noticed used greenery stacked near the stage, extra white roses decorating the welcome display, candles waiting to be placed, and several smaller bouquets positioned throughout the cocktail lounge. She smiled gently. "I do not need thin air." She carefully slipped off her high heels and placed them beneath a nearby chair. Rolling the sleeves of her light sweater above her wrists, she gathered floral shears, ribbon, and a bucket of fresh water. "I just need everyone to stop panicking." The room seemed to pause. Without waiting for permission, Marin began working. She dismantled several secondary displays that guests would barely notice, preserving every healthy bloom. She repositioned greenery to create more depth, trimmed damaged stems, adjusted heights, and rebuilt each layer with astonishing speed. Every movement felt practiced, graceful, and completely confident. Callum watched quietly from across the ballroom. He had spent years leading thousands of employees, yet he recognized genuine leadership the moment he saw it. Marin never raised her voice. She never criticized anyone. Instead, she gave calm directions that somehow made everyone around her more capable. "Could someone please bring me another vase from the storage room?" she asked with a warm smile. "Would you mind placing those candles 6 inches farther apart?" "Thank you. That will make the flowers stand out better." One by one, nervous staff members stopped arguing and started helping. Even the coordinator who had blamed her moments earlier found herself following Marin's instructions without realizing it. Callum quietly removed his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and walked toward the work table. "What can I do?" Marin looked up, surprised to see him standing beside her. "You are still here? Apparently my shift keeps getting longer." She laughed despite the pressure surrounding them. "Then I have the perfect job for you. Strip every thorn from these roses and keep the stems about 10 inches long." "I think I can manage that." They worked side by side in comfortable silence. Every few minutes their hands reached for the same ribbon or the same flower, followed by an awkward smile before each quietly stepped aside for the other. Time seemed to disappear beneath the scent of fresh eucalyptus and lavender. Callum found himself admiring not only the beauty Marin created, but also the quiet joy she carried while creating it. Even under impossible pressure, she treated every flower with care, every volunteer with respect, and every problem as something temporary rather than overwhelming. "There," Marin whispered at last as she stepped away from the completed centerpiece. The arrangement looked even more elegant than the original design. Cascading white roses surrounded soft lavender blooms, while delicate greenery flowed naturally across the polished table like a living painting. The old silver brooch rested at the center of the ribbon, catching the candlelight in a way that made it seem almost luminous. Several staff members applauded without thinking. The coordinator who had doubted her stared in disbelief. "That is better than what we ordered." Marin smiled modestly. Sometimes unexpected things turn out more personal. At that exact moment, Sophie entered the ballroom before the reception began. She stopped in front of the sweetheart table, tears instantly filling her eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. She hugged Marin tightly without asking how it had happened because she already knew exactly who had saved the evening. Watching from only a few feet away, Callum realized something that surprised even him. He had noticed Marin's kindness first. He admired her strength second. But standing there surrounded by flowers she had rescued with nothing more than skill, patience, and heart, he understood that somewhere between the rainstorm, the wrong doorway, In this impossible evening, admiration had quietly become something far deeper. The reception began beneath a ceiling filled with thousands of tiny lights that reflected against crystal glasses like scattered stars. Laughter replaced the nervous energy that had filled the ballroom only an hour earlier, and every guest seemed completely unaware that the evening had nearly unraveled before it ever began. Marin stood near the edge of the room with the other bridesmaids, finally allowing herself a quiet moment to breathe. Sophie caught her eye from the sweetheart table, smiled with unmistakable gratitude, and mouthed two simple words. "Thank you." Marin answered with a small nod. That was more than enough. Watching her friend happy made every stressful minute worthwhile. Across the ballroom, Callum remained surrounded by investors, family friends, and business associates who all seemed eager for a conversation. He answered politely, shook hands when expected, and smiled at the appropriate moments, yet his attention drifted toward the same person every few minutes. Ethan noticed immediately. "You have ignored 3 people trying to discuss hotel expansions," he said with a grin. "That has never happened before." Callum took a sip of sparkling water without looking away from Marin. "Perhaps tonight there are more important conversations." Ethan followed his gaze and laughed quietly. "You are in trouble." Before Callum could respond, the band began playing the first dance. The newlyweds stepped onto the polished floor while every guest gathered around them. The room fell into a comfortable silence as Sophie rested her head on her husband's shoulder, smiling as though the rest of the world had disappeared. Marin felt her eyes grow warm. She had always loved weddings, not because of expensive venues or elegant decorations, but because for a few minutes people remembered what truly mattered: commitment, forgiveness, hope. When the first dance ended, the band invited other couples onto the floor. Friends encouraged one another to join. Laughter filled every corner of the ballroom, and slowly the dance floor became crowded. Marin stayed where she was, perfectly content watching everyone else. "You are not dancing?" Callum asked as he appeared beside her. She smiled. "I think I have done enough running around for one day." "That is exactly why you deserve one dance." She looked toward the crowded floor, then back at him with an amused expression. "I thought employees were supposed to stay busy during receptions." His eyes softened. "Maybe this employee is taking a short break." Marin laughed. "I suppose even managers are allowed 15 minutes. She accepted his outstretched hand. As they stepped onto the dance floor, neither of them seemed interested in showing off complicated steps. They simply moved slowly with the music, surrounded by conversations, laughter, and the warm glow of candlelight. "I never thanked you properly," Marin said after a few quiet moments. "You helped me at least 5 different times today. I enjoyed helping. Most people would have disappeared after the first favor. Most people are not me." She smiled at that answer. Apparently not. For a little while neither of them spoke. The silence never felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, almost surprising after the chaos that had brought them together. Finally Marin asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "What made you choose this kind of work?" Callum considered the question carefully. "I like creating places where people celebrate important moments." She nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. You seem happiest when everyone else feels taken care of." The unexpected observation caught him completely off guard. Very few people had ever described his work that way. Most admired the luxury, the profits, or the reputation. Marin had somehow noticed the purpose beneath it. Before he could answer, her phone vibrated inside the small evening bag hanging from her shoulder. She glanced at the screen, and the warmth immediately disappeared from her face. She stepped away from the dance floor and answered quietly. "Hello? Yes, this is Marin." Callum remained where he was, unable to hear the entire conversation, but he noticed her shoulders slowly tense. "I understand," she said softly. "No, I am not asking for more time. I just wanted to know if there was any possibility." She listened for several seconds before forcing a polite smile that the caller could not even see. "Thank you for letting me know." She ended the call and stared at the dark screen without moving. Callum approached carefully. "Is everything all right?" She managed a small smile that failed to reach her eyes. "It will be." He recognized the familiar answer immediately. It was the kind people gave when they wanted to protect everyone else from carrying their burdens. After a long breath, she looked toward him. "The owner of my building called. If I cannot pay the remaining balance by tomorrow afternoon, the locks on my flower shop will be changed." She gave a quiet laugh that sounded much sadder than amused. Funny, isn't it? I spent all day helping save someone else's celebration while wondering whether my own little dream will still exist tomorrow. Before Callum could say a single word, the master of ceremonies announced that every guest should gather for a special recognition of those who had helped. Make the wedding unforgettable. As applause filled the ballroom once again, Marin slipped her phone back into her bag, unaware that the evening was quietly leading both of them toward a truth neither of them was prepared to face. The applause slowly faded as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage at the center of the ballroom with a warm smile. "Before tonight becomes nothing more than a beautiful memory," he said. "The bride and groom would like to recognize a few people whose generosity and hard work made this celebration possible." Sophie reached for the microphone first. "There is one person who deserves more thanks than anyone realizes." She searched the crowd until her eyes found Marin. She arrived later than she planned because she stopped to help someone she had never met, and somehow she still managed to save our wedding twice in one day. "If you think these flowers are beautiful, you should know she created half of them again less than an hour before dinner." The ballroom erupted into applause as every guest turned toward Marin. Her cheeks immediately flushed with embarrassment. She shook her head, silently wishing everyone would stop looking at her. "Come up here," Sophie called with a smile. Marin hesitated before walking toward the stage, feeling completely out of place beneath the elegant chandeliers and the attention of hundreds of strangers. Sophie hugged her tightly. "You have always been the person who fixes everything without asking for credit," she whispered. "Tonight you deserve some." The room applauded again. Marin smiled politely, thanked everyone for their kindness, and quickly stepped back, hoping the spotlight would move elsewhere. It did. Ethan accepted the microphone next with an amused grin. "Now I have the much easier job of thanking the man who quietly made this entire weekend possible." He looked toward the front table. "Most of you know him as my oldest friend. The rest of you know him as the founder and owner of Whitmore Heritage Resorts. Please help me thank Mr. Callum Whitmore for hosting this wedding and for making every impossible request somehow become possible." Time seemed to stop. Marin blinked once, convinced she had misunderstood. The applause grew louder as Callum stood from his chair. Guests around him rose to their feet in admiration. Several executives shook his hand before he even reached the stage. The large screen behind the band displayed a collection of wedding photographs, followed by a simple message that read, "With heartfelt gratitude to Callum Whitmore and the Whitmore Heritage family." Marin felt the air leave her lungs. Founder, owner, Whitmore Heritage. She slowly turned toward the ballroom windows where the resort logo had been etched into every piece of glass all afternoon. She had seen the name countless times without ever connecting it to the man who had zipped her dress, carried flower arrangements, stripped thorns from roses, and driven her across the property in an ordinary sedan. Every conversation replayed inside her mind with painful clarity. "You work here. Whoever signs your paycheck should give you a raise. Managers deserve 15 minutes too." He had answered every misunderstanding without technically lying, yet he had never told her the truth either. Callum accepted the microphone, but found himself looking only at Marin. The applause gradually faded. "This weekend was never about me," he began. "It was about two people choosing a lifetime together." His voice remained steady, but his eyes never left hers. "I also learned today that the people who leave the greatest impression are often the ones no one expects." Marin could not stay another second. She quietly stepped away from the crowd and walked toward the ballroom entrance before anyone noticed. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the music. She reached the garden terrace just as Callum hurried after her. "Marin!" She stopped, but did not turn around immediately. The cool evening air carried the scent of fresh lavender from the centerpieces they had created together. When she finally faced him, disappointment filled her eyes far more than anger. "You own this place." Callum nodded once. "Yes. You let me believe you worked here as a manager. I never wanted to embarrass you." She gave a quiet, unbelieving laugh. "Do you know what embarrasses me? Realizing that every honest conversation we had happened while everyone else in this building knew exactly who you were except me. I was trying to be normal." "Normal?" she repeated softly. "Callum, you had the luxury of deciding when to be normal. I never had the luxury of knowing who I was actually talking to." He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "I never laughed at you. No, she admitted. You were kind to me. That is what makes this hurt. She looked down at the weathered silver brooch resting against the ribbon of her bouquet before lifting her eyes back to his. I trusted the man who helped me because I believed he understood my world. Now I do not even know if any of it was real. Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked into the quiet night, leaving Callum standing alone beneath the glowing lights of the resort that suddenly felt far less impressive than the woman disappearing beyond its gates. The wedding ended long after midnight, but Callum Whitmore remained alone inside the silent ballroom long after the final guests had gone home. Candle flames had been extinguished, chairs were being folded, and the beautiful arrangements Marin had rescued only hours earlier still filled the room with the faint scent of lavender. He stood beside the sweetheart table, looking at the weathered silver brooch resting exactly where she had left it while gathering her things in a hurry. One of the ribbons had come loose during the reception, and in the confusion she had never realized the keepsake had remained behind. Callum carefully picked it up, turning the familiar piece of silver between his fingers. The tiny scratches were still there. The delicate repairs her mother had made years before were still visible. Beautiful things are worth fixing instead of replacing. Her words echoed inside his mind with uncomfortable clarity. For the first time in years, he understood that the most valuable thing he had damaged could not be repaired with money. Early the next morning, Callum sat alone in the executive conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. A stack of acquisition reports waited beside his coffee, but one file immediately caught his attention. Holloway Floral Studio. The name appeared inside a portfolio of recently acquired commercial properties managed by one of Whitmore Heritage's investment divisions. He opened the report and read every page in silence. The building housing Marin's flower shop had been purchased 6 months earlier by a real estate company that had quietly become part of his expanding business group. A recommendation from the regional management team proposed increasing rents by nearly 40% over the next year in order to attract luxury retailers. Several small businesses were already scheduled to leave. Holloway Floral Studio appeared on the list marked unlikely to renew. Callum slowly closed the folder. Yesterday, those pages would have looked like ordinary business strategy. Today, they carried the weight of someone's dream. An hour later, the executive board gathered for its weekly meeting expecting another discussion about expansion plans. Instead, Callum surprised everyone. Before we review new projects, he began calmly, we are going to discuss the people affected by the ones we already approved. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses. Are you referring to the downtown redevelopment initiative? Yes. The vice president responsible for commercial leasing immediately opened a presentation showing projected revenue increases. The new rental structure is expected to improve annual returns significantly. Callum listened quietly before asking a single question. How many family-owned businesses will disappear because of those increases? The room became noticeably quieter. One executive answered carefully. Approximately 23 over the next 18 months, but replacement tenants are expected to generate stronger long-term value. Callum folded his hands. Value for whom? No one answered immediately. Finally, he pushed the reports aside. Effective today, suspend every scheduled rent increase affecting independently owned businesses until we complete a full review. Several executives looked genuinely shocked. That decision could cost millions, someone said. Perhaps, Callum replied. But I have spent too many years measuring success by numbers while ignoring the people behind them. The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but Callum did not change his decision. That afternoon, he drove alone to Holloway Floral Studio without calling ahead. The small shop looked exactly as Marin had described. Fresh flowers lined the front windows. Handwritten chalkboard signs welcomed customers. A tiny brass bell above the entrance rang softly as he stepped inside. Marin looked up from trimming white roses. The warmth that had once appeared so naturally in her smile disappeared almost instantly. We are closed, she said politely before noticing who had entered. Silence settled between them. I came to return something, Callum said. He carefully placed the silver brooch on the wooden counter between them. Marin stared at it with visible relief before gently picking it up. Her fingers rested on the familiar scratches for several seconds. Thank you, she said quietly. She expected him to leave. Instead, he remained where he was. I also came to apologize. She met his eyes without speaking. Not because I own a company, he continued. Because I let you build trust without giving you the truth you deserved. Marin looked away toward the rows of fresh flowers. An apology does not change what happened. I know. He nodded slowly. That is why I am not asking you to forgive me today. He reached into his jacket and removed a simple envelope. Inside is not a check. It is not a gift. It is a proposal that has nothing to do with charity. Marin did not touch it. What kind of proposal? Our company is creating a new floral design program for every Whitmore heritage property across the country. I want independent artists, not factory suppliers, to shape the experience guests remember. If you ever decide to read it, you will find a standard business contract with fair pricing, full creative ownership of your designs, and complete freedom to decline. Whether you sign it or throw it away is entirely your choice. He placed the envelope beside the brooch. For once, I do not want money to make the decision. I want respect to make it first. 3 months passed before Marin finally opened the envelope. During those weeks, Callum never called to persuade her, never sent expensive gifts, and never asked anyone else to speak on his behalf. The only thing that arrived every Friday morning was a handwritten note from a local customer thanking Holloway Floral Studio for another beautiful arrangement, followed by a receipt showing the flowers had been purchased anonymously for a nearby nursing home, a children's reading program, or a community shelter. Marin eventually discovered the orders had all been placed through Whitmore Heritage, but none of them advertised the company or mentioned Callum's name. They simply supported a small business while bringing beauty to people who needed it most. It was the kind of quiet kindness that expected nothing in return. Curious more than convinced, Marin accepted a meeting at one of Callum's hotels 6 weeks later. This time there was no private dining room, no executive suite, and no audience. She found him in the service hallway wearing a simple blue work shirt beside several hotel employees, helping unload fresh flower buckets from a delivery truck before the morning conference began. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands were damp from changing water, and he greeted every employee by name. When he noticed Marin standing nearby, he smiled with the same warmth she had seen on the day they first met. Good morning. She looked around the hallway before answering. You are actually working. He laughed softly. Turns out managers are still allowed 15-minute breaks, but they should also know what happens during the other 7 hours and 45 minutes. That answer earned the first genuine smile she had given him since the wedding. Their business meeting lasted less than an hour because the contract required almost no negotiation. Every page reflected the promise he had made. Fair compensation, creative independence, no exclusive obligations, no hidden ownership clauses. Holloway Floral Studio would remain entirely hers. Whitmore Heritage would simply become a client that respected her work instead of controlling it. Why? She finally asked after signing the final page. Because the old version of me would have bought your shop, Callum admitted honestly. The man you met taught me that helping someone should never require taking away what already belongs to them. Business slowly became friendship again. Friendship gradually became trust. Callum visited the flower shop without cameras, announcements, or assistants. Some mornings he swept the sidewalk after autumn leaves covered the entrance. Other afternoons, he carried heavy buckets into the cooler because he happened to arrive before a shipment was finished. He learned the names of flowers he had never noticed before. He discovered that lavender smelled strongest just before sunset, that white roses opened differently depending on the season, and that Marin still touched her mother's silver brooch whenever she doubted herself. Nearly a year after the wedding where everything had begun, another celebration filled the gardens of Blackwood Ridge Resort. This time Marin had been chosen as the lead floral designer for the entire event. Every arrangement carried her unmistakable style, natural, elegant, and just imperfect enough to feel alive. After the ceremony ended, she quietly slipped away from the reception for a moment of silence. Her feet carried her almost without thinking toward the same private room where she had once burst through the wrong doors in a rain-soaked panic. She smiled as she pushed them open. Callum was already waiting inside. You are late, he teased gently. Marin laughed, shaking her head. No, I learned something a long time ago. She reached into her small bouquet and removed the weathered silver brooch, now polished but still carrying every tiny mark that told its story. Someone who arrives late can still arrive exactly when they are needed. Callum stepped closer and carefully accepted the brooch before fastening it to a fresh lavender ribbon wrapped around a single white rose. Then he looked into her eyes with complete certainty. "You did not change my life because you walked into the wrong room," he said quietly. "You changed it because you reminded me that success means very little if it cannot make room for honesty, kindness, and the courage to admit when you are wrong." He reached into his jacket and revealed a small velvet box. "Maren Holloway, every important moment in my life has become better because you were part of it. Will you let me spend the rest of my life earning the trust that began with one unforgettable misunderstanding?" Tears filled her eyes as she smiled through them. "Yes," she whispered, "but only if you promise never to pretend to be the manager again." Callum laughed, slipped the ring gently onto her finger, and answered, "I cannot promise that. Sometimes the owner still needs to carry flowers." Outside, guests applauded as the newly married couple they had just celebrated invited everyone back to the ballroom. Moments later, another wave of joyful applause echoed through the gardens when Callum and Maren stepped outside hand in hand. Very few people knew how their story had truly begun, but every person watching could see exactly why it had lasted. In the end, it was never wealth that won her heart. It was the man who learned that real leadership begins the moment status stops speaking louder than character, and that the most beautiful things in life, just like an old silver brooch, are not valuable because they are perfect, but because they are loved enough to be carefully repaired instead of replaced. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.